When I think of the March family, I do not see faces first. I see light, lamplight spilling from a modest window onto winter snow, a golden rectangle pressed against the long dark of our New England street. I see the outline of 4 heads clustered together, sometimes bent in argument, sometimes thrown back in laughter, always moving. The first time I saw that light, I was still more boy than man, a lonely heir in a large house that did not quite know what to do with me. My grandfather's mansion stood across from theirs like an old, dignified ship at anchor. It had high windows, polished stairs, and rooms that echoed when you walked through them. It was comfortable, respectable, well supplied. Yet somehow, it always felt slightly too big, as if it had been built for a life that had never quite arrived. I, Theodore Lawrence, had grown used to wandering its corridors with only music and servants for company. My tutor drilled Latin into my head. My grandfather checked my progress with a stern kindness that made me both grateful and resentful. And the piano in the grand salon was my one true ally. Playing was how I spoke to a world that rarely asked what I felt. Across the way, in the smaller house with the peeling paint, there was a different kind of music. I did not know it by tune at first. I knew it by rhythm. Doors opened and closed. Voices rose in dispute, then softened into apology. Kettles sang. Someone ran up and down stairs, often enough to wear a groove in them. Every sound said the same thing to me. Life is busy in there. Life is crowded and imperfect and alive. The first real glimpse I had of the March girls was through our upstairs window one December afternoon. Snow had been falling all day, smoothing the roofs, muting the usual street noises. My grandfather had gone out. My tutor had given me the afternoon free. I might have spent it at the piano, but idleness and curiosity are close cousins, and they both pulled me to the window. Across the street, 4 figures sat around a small table. I could see only the top halves of their bodies, framed by the window like a painting that refused to hold still. The eldest, with her neat hair and composed manner, counted something that looked like coins and frowned thoughtfully. Beside her, a tall girl with untidy hair waved a hand dramatically, clearly arguing about something important. On the other side, a slight figure with smooth brown hair folded her hands as if to keep the peace by sheer stillness. The youngest, fair and delicate, leaned in with a mixture of calculation and hope. They did not know they were being watched, and so they were entirely themselves. From my quiet vantage point, I tried to guess their conversation. The way the tall one flung herself back in her chair told me she had grand ambitions. The way the eldest pinched her lips made me think of responsibility and bills. The little one, tucked safely by the fire, had the look of a person who finds more comfort in home than in any adventure the world could offer. The youngest's eyes sparkled even at a distance, as if she was already dreaming of some future stage where everyone would look at her the way I was looking now. Later I would learn their names. Meg, the eldest. Joe, my wild comrade in every nonsense. Beth, the quiet music of the house. Amy, the little artist who took herself far more seriously than anyone else dared. But that afternoon they were simply 4 unknown lives across the street, a small universe that I longed to enter. The longing surprised me. I had been raised among polished boots and polished manners, taught that it was enough to have good prospects and a famous grandfather. Yet, standing at that window, watching four girls in a shabby parlour, I felt something I had not felt in a long time. I felt invited, though no invitation had been sent. But we still wonder whether a heart learns more from comfort or from the ache of standing just outside a warm door. You may know that feeling yourself. Perhaps you have walked past a window where friends leaned together in conversation and felt, for a moment, like a ghost. It is a peculiar sort of hunger, that ache for a place where your absence would be noticed. From my window, I watched as the girl's mother entered the room. I could not distinguish her features, only the gentle authority in the way their heads turned. The argument shifted into listening. Shoulders relaxed. Whatever decision was made, it was accepted. The small tableau closed as the curtains were drawn, and the golden square of light became a soft blur on the snow. I turned away from the window then, but the image stayed with me. It followed me down the wide staircase, past the portraits of ancestors who did not look as if they had ever sat around a small table worrying over coins. It echoed in the silent dining room where the polished silver reflected only my own solitary face. It even crept into my music that evening, softening the edges of a piece I had played many times without once thinking of four girls and their mother across the street. That night, lying awake in a room larger than their entire parlour, I listened to the distant sounds of their household. A burst of laughter, a door closing, a faint scrap of melody. The house that held me was silent and grand. The house that called to me was small and noisy. Somewhere between those two truths, my future shifted, though I could not yet have said how. If you are willing, I invite you now to sit with me at that upstairs window again, as I was then, a restless boy caught between duty and desire. We will watch together as the March family steps into my life and I into theirs, altering each other in ways none of us could have predicted. For some stories begin with a knock or a letter. Mine began with a lighted window and the simple wish to go inside. It did not take long for curiosity to turn into opportunity. The winter of which I speak was marked by more than snow. The war lay over the country like a great grey cloud, and even in our sheltered corner of New England one felt its shadow. Men marched away, letters arrived with black edges, women learned to live with absence as if it were another member of the household. My own parents were gone long before, but loss hangs in the air even when it is not your own. For the March family it was something closer. Their father was away serving as a chaplain, and though I did not yet know his gentle face, I could see the imprint of his absence in the way his daughters leaned toward their mother, as if warmth might be shared like bread. There was a look people wore that winter, half courage and half fatigue. I saw it every time Mrs. March crossed our street, shawl drawn close, step brisk, but never sharp, as if she carried not just parcels, but the mood of her whole house. The first time I met the girls properly was not in their home, but in the warmer chaos of a New Year's dance. My aunt had dragged me there in the hope that contact with respectable company would polish my manners. I went with the reluctance of a boy who would have preferred his piano. The house was full of noise, lace, and candle heat. I was choosing which doorway to hide in when I saw a familiar head of unruly brown hair. Jo March stood in a corner, tugging anxiously at a scorched patch on the back of her dress, hoping no one would notice. She looked like someone who had been dropped by mistake into a room of silk and was trying to decide whether to flee or to laugh at it. Beside her, Meg smoothed her gloves with the air of a young lady who knew exactly how things ought to be done and knew they fell several inches short of that ideal. I recognized them from the window, yet here they were, in borrowed finery, trying to inhabit roles that did not quite fit. Before I could lose my nerve, Joe caught my eye and, to my astonishment, pulled a face which clearly meant, "This is all absurd, is it not?" It was the first time anyone at such a gathering had treated me as a fellow conspirator rather than a candidate for polite conversation. I crossed the room as if summoned. Our introduction was clumsy and quickly done. Meg said the right things. Joe did not. She blurted out that she had seen me moping at my window and thought I looked dreadfully bored. No one had ever said something so impolite to me with such innocence. It was like being doused with cold water, bracing and unexpectedly welcome. We danced, though Joe declared that she hated fancy steps and her shoes pinched. When she trod on my foot, which she did more than once, she apologized with such comic despair that I laughed aloud. The stiffness went out of me. I talked more freely than I had in years, not because I had grown more charming, but because, for the first time, it did not seem to matter whether I impressed anyone. But we still wonder whether the first real kindness we receive is the one that shows us we are safe, even when we are awkward. Perhaps you have known such a moment yourself, that first conversation where you felt no need to smooth your edges. It is like loosening a tight collar, a small adjustment that lets you breathe. After that night, the March girls were no longer figures in a distant window. They were people with voices, faults, and a puzzling tendency to treat me as though I already belonged. A few days later, the river froze flat, a sheet of glass laid under the sky. From an upstairs window, I watched Joe and her youngest sister Amy set out to skate. Joe moved boldly, carving strong lines on the ice. Amy followed with caution and admiration she would never admit. From my bank, I could see what they could not. Along the far edge, the ice had not taken properly. It was darker there, thinner, as treacherous as a flattering lie. I shouted, but the wind scattered my voice. Joe skimmed across the danger, light and sure, and passed over without knowing. Amy, determined not to be left behind, followed the same path with less grace and more weight. I heard the crack before I saw her vanish. There are moments when the body moves before thought. I ran, grabbing a fence rail as I went, the cold cutting my lungs. By the time Joe's scream had finished, I was on the ice, crawling toward the broken place. The wood spread under me. Together we dragged Amy out, Joe white with terror, Amy white with shock, all of us dripping in the winter light. Back at their house, Mrs. March and the others descended upon Amy, with towels, blankets, and scolding. That was half anger and half relief. In the confusion, Joe and I exchanged a glance that said more than thanks. She had felt in that instant how near she had come to losing the sister she so often quarrelled with. I had felt, without words, that I could not bear to see their bright circle broken. Later, over tea that both burned and comforted, the tale of my heroics was told with more enthusiasm than accuracy. I muttered that anyone would have done the same, which is never entirely true. Amy regarded me with new, solemn respect, as if entering the debt into an invisible ledger. I felt at once taller and more ridiculous than I had in my life. But we still wonder whether the moments that bind us to others are the ones we choose, or the ones that simply happen while we are busy being ourselves. If nothing else, the rescue gave me a respectable excuse to cross the street more often. My grandfather, who feared idle company, watched my growing friendship with the Marches with cautious approval. He could not deny the improvement in my spirits. The big house felt less like a museum when I knew that just opposite, in the smaller house, where doors banged and voices overlapped, there were people who would notice if I stayed away too long. There is a kind of wealth that has nothing to do with coins, but I did not understand that yet when I first began slipping in and out of the March household, like an adopted stray. From my side of the street, I had grown accustomed to seeing poverty as something distant, an unfortunate condition we addressed with donations and signatures. Inside their small parlour, I learned that need was not an abstraction, but a series of very specific choices made every single day. I remember one cold morning when snow piled against the doorstep, and the air was sharp with the promise of Christmas. At our house, the cook had prepared a breakfast that would have suited a minor prince. There were hot rolls, sausages, rich coffee, golden eggs puffed in cream. I was about to sit down when across the street I saw 4 girls and their mother leaving their house, carrying a basket between them. They were laughing, though the wind bit at their faces. Later I learned they were bringing their own simple Christmas breakfast to a poorer family, the Hummels, whose children were hungry and whose fire had all but gone out. The Marches came home cold and empty-handed, their own table bare, only to find that my grandfather, informed of their charity, had ordered our feast sent straight to their door. I wish I could tell you I had thought of it first. I had not. I was still learning that generosity can be as much an adventure as any schoolboy prank. That afternoon, when I went over with a message from my grandfather, I found the March parlour warmer than I had ever seen it, not because of the fire, though it burned bright, but because giving seemed to have transformed their hunger into a kind of quiet pride. Meg teased that they had become beggars in reverse. Amy boasted that she had carried the heaviest dish. Joe declared that the food tasted twice as good when it came as a surprise, and Beth simply looked as if the world had unfolded exactly as it ought. It struck me then that their poverty, which from the outside looked so stark, contained a richness my own house had never quite managed. They had little, but they knew exactly what they had and how far it must stretch. At one of their evening gatherings, I began to see what that meant. Meg's dress was worn but carefully brushed. Joe's cuffs were frayed and ink-stained. Beth's shoes shone over thin leather. Amy hoarded pencil stubs for her sketches as if they were bars of gold. Small economies like these were invisible to those who had never had to count the cost of paper, sugar, or coal. On one such evening, Meg shyly confessed that she had been invited to stay with the rich Moffat family. I had seen the Moffat carriages roll past our house, heavy with velvet and perfume. Meg spoke of the parties she might attend, the dresses she might wear, if only she had the right fabric and the right ribbons. Joe scoffed at all this nonsense, insisting that frills were a trap. But I saw the way Meg's eyes lingered on the thought of being, just once, effortless and admired. When she left for the Moffats, she looked as elegant as their limited means could contrive. When she returned, there was a slight dimming about her, as if some inner light had been both lit and troubled. She told us, in pieces at first, and then with more boldness, of the party where she had been dressed up in borrowed finery, coaxed into behaving like a fashionable young lady, and almost pushed toward me as if she were a desirable bargain and I a possible buyer. I was furious on her behalf before she finished the tale. For all my grandfather's wealth, I had never thought of marriage as a transaction until I saw it hinted at in those careless jokes. Meg, flushed with shame, admitted that part of her had liked being admired, liked the silks and perfumes, liked feeling that she belonged in those bright rooms. But she also confessed that she had felt hollow there, like a doll that had been dressed for someone else's amusement. Mrs. March listened without interruption, her hands folded in her lap. When Meg finished, half defiant and half mortified, their mother said quietly that she would rather see her daughters live honestly in worn dresses than dance through life as decorations in other people's stories. There was love in her reproof and something like relief in Meg's answering tears. I sat in the corner, more observer than participant, and absorbed a lesson no tutor had ever thought to give me. But we still wonder whether we hide our truest selves behind what we can afford to wear, or behind what we cannot. The Marches were no saints. Amy longed for pretty things and good society. Joe raged against the limitations of their income when it meant turning down pleasures or opportunities. Meg had her moments of vanity. Beth her quiet wish for a better piano. Yet what struck me most was not their discontent, but their determination not to let it sour them. In our house, extravagance was an old habit. I had grown used to seeing waste without much thought. A cake half eaten, a coat replaced while still serviceable, a party thrown more from boredom than celebration. The Marches, by contrast, treated small pleasures as treasures. A new ribbon, a book, an evening with the piano tuned and everyone in good spirits. These were enough to light their faces. As I moved between my grandfather's house and theirs, I began to feel as if I carried two currencies. One was measured in dollars, investments, and the silent approval of a man who had built his fortune through shrewdness and effort. The other was counted in shared meals, honest talk, and the sense that my presence could add warmth to a room instead of simply filling a chair. On certain evenings I would look around the March parlour and see worn furniture, patched carpets, a fire that needed careful feeding, and yet in those same moments I felt wealthier than I had ever felt in my life. They let me share their lack without shame, and their abundance without suspicion. I began to suspect that this was what I had been hungry for without knowing it. If you had seen my grandfather's house in those days, you might have thought it a place where nothing essential was lacking. There were more rooms than two people could reasonably use, and carpets so thick that sound seemed to sink into them. The chandeliers were polished, the silver shone, and the maids moved efficiently through long-established routines. From the outside, it suggested security and the polite kind of happiness that sits up straight at the dinner table. Inside, it often felt like an echo. My grandfather was not an unkind man, but he had lived a long life of discipline and loss. He had lost his only daughter, my mother, and from that wound had grown both his protectiveness and his severity. He wanted me to be everything her memory demanded, and he trusted duty more than affection to get me there. Before I knew the March girls, most of our conversations were inventories. Had I practiced my music? How were my marks in Latin? Did I intend to waste the opportunities his money had purchased? They were questions meant to secure my future, yet they often left my present feeling rather empty. When Jo and her sisters tumbled into my life, they did not ask about my grades. They did not seem particularly awed by the house either. The first time Jo visited, she arrived with snow on her boots and no idea how loud her voice sounded in the quiet hall. She looked up at the high ceiling, whistled low, and said she would go mad in a place where you had to be careful not to breathe too hard for fear of disturbing the furniture. My grandfather, hearing this, almost smiled. It was Beth, though, who changed the house most. She was timid at first, terrified of intruding, but he had noticed how her eyes lingered on the piano whenever she visited me. We had a fine instrument in the drawing room that stood unused more often than not. My own playing was better suited to noisy afternoons than to comforting evenings. Beth's hands, by contrast, had a shyness that turned into grace the moment they touched the keys. One day, when I was out, my grandfather sent for her. He had his own reasons, rooted in memories of a daughter who had once loved music as much as Beth did. When I returned, I found the great drawing room different, as if someone had opened a window in a house that had been sealed for years. Beth was at the piano, her head bent, her fingers coaxing out a simple hymn. My grandfather sat nearby, pretending to read a newspaper that had not turned a page for some time. I watched from the doorway, not daring to interrupt. Beth did not play like someone performing. She played as if she were mending something fragile. Each note seemed to stitch together a small tear in the silence. After that day, she came often. At first, she crept in like a mouse, terrified of making noise. In time, she learned that the old man who had once frightened her was more bark than bite. He would grumble about the draught when she opened the window or about the dust on the piano keys. But he began keeping a small jar of sweets in his desk, which mysteriously appeared on the music stand whenever she arrived. You might say it was only a child playing a piano in a rich man's house, but to me it felt like watching the colour come back into a faded painting. But we still wonder whether it is the grand gestures that heal old griefs, or the small repeated moments when someone sits beside our loneliness and quietly refuses to be frightened by it. The sound of Beth's music drifted up the staircase, down the corridors, into corners that had forgotten laughter. Servants paused at their tasks to listen. My grandfather's tread grew less heavy. I found myself coming home earlier, drawn not by duty, but by the possibility of a shared hour that did not feel like an appointment. Of course, Jo declared that our house was still a mausoleum. She said this cheerfully, as if criticizing the architecture were an act of friendship. She filled the drawing room with her opinions whenever she accompanied Beth, striding from window to window as if assessing how the place might be improved. Her suggestions ranged from opening a school for boys in the empty bedrooms to turning the ballroom into a theatre. My grandfather, to his credit, did not evict her. There was something about Jo's noisy honesty that amused him, even when it scandalized his sense of order. He began inviting her to stay for tea, ostensibly to keep Beth company, though I suspect he enjoyed the novelty of someone who did not treat him like an institution. I found myself in a strange position. In the March house, I was the wealthy neighbour who could supply carriages, tickets, and cakes. In my own house, I became the boy whose fortune had finally attracted the right sort of company. Only the company was not what anyone had predicted. Instead of polished young ladies from suitable families, I brought home a lanky girl with ink on her fingers and a quiet one who blushed whenever you looked at her too kindly. Some evenings, after the sisters had gone, my grandfather would look at me across the dinner table with an expression I had not seen before. There was the usual sternness, but also something like curiosity. Once, after a particularly noisy visit during which Joe had argued that I should go to college and do something sensible instead of drifting, he cleared his throat and asked what I thought of such plans. I began to see that he, too, was being altered by this invasion of girlhood and music. The house was no longer an echo chamber. It was, hesitantly, becoming a place people might enter for reasons other than obligation. There were still tensions, of course. The difference in our circumstances never entirely disappeared. At times I heard relatives of his suggest that it was dangerous for me to be so intimate with a family that had little to offer but affection. They spoke of suitable matches and proper circles, as if a heart could be neatly arranged on a social calendar. Yet when I weighed their cautions against the look on Beth's face when she found a new piece of music on the stand, or the sound of Joe's laughter bouncing off the high ceiling, their arguments seemed curiously thin. I began to understand that the big house and the little one across the street offered two different kinds of safety. In mine, there was financial security, respectable connections, and the comfort of knowing that nothing essential would be lacking. In theirs, there was a different promise, that even when something was lacking, no one would be left to face the lack alone. Work, which had always been an abstract duty in my world, became something more complicated once I began to watch the March sisters take their first serious steps into it. In my grandfather's house, work meant investment reports on his desk and scales on my piano. Money arrived from distant enterprises I had never seen, as if the world itself politely handed us its profits. Across the street, work was closer to the skin. It left marks on hands, on tempers, on dreams. I remember watching Meg set off each mornings as a governess. She wore a simple but carefully mended dress, her gloves clean though not new. She walked with a determined grace, trying not to show how much she disliked the pretensions of the wealthy family she served. At the Moffats, she had to teach children who felt entitled to command her and then criticize her. When she came home, tired and still gentle, I understood that her small salary had been bought with more than ours. Jo, meanwhile, marched up to Aunt March's grand house to earn her keep as companion and reader. She read sermons aloud, endured the old lady's moods, and smuggled bits of her own stories into the duller texts when she thought no one was listening. On fine days, she wheeled Aunt March out for air while plotting novels in her head. Later, she would spill those plots to me in whispers, more eager for an honest listener than for praise. Beth stayed home. That too was work, though she never called it by that name. She kept the house in order, saw that the fire was lit, cared for their mother and the younger ones, and practiced the piano whenever she could. If Meg's labour was visible in her tired posture and Jo's in her ink-stained cuffs, Beth's was woven quietly into the smooth running of the household. The world often fails to notice that sort of labour until it ceases. Amy went to school, where work took the form of sums she disliked and drawing lessons she craved. Her ambition was the kind that looked like vanity, to those who did not know her. She wanted beauty, but she wanted to make it, not only to wear it. When she sketched my profile one afternoon and then tore it up because the line of the nose displeased her, I realized her standards for herself were far harsher than the ones she applied to anyone else. From my point of view, I seemed to float above all this. My tasks were to recite, to practice, to prepare to inherit a life already plotted out. I envied them the clarity of their struggle, even as I pitied the strain of it. Their coins were counted and recounted. Mine appeared with the regularity of the sunrise. Yet when Meg spoke of saving for new fabric, when Joe exulted over a payment for a story in a newspaper, when Amy dreamed of Italy, I felt as though they were climbing a mountain while I was being driven around its base in a carriage. There came a day when the cost of their courage became more sharply defined. A letter arrived bearing the news that Mr. March had fallen ill while away with the army. The atmosphere in their little house altered at once. Fear and determination shared the same chair at their table. Someone must go to him, and that meant money they did not have. Jo appeared at our door with a strained but blazing look in her eyes. She had taken a decision before coming, and was now merely carrying it out. There had been a token of luxury in their home, a cascade of chestnut hair that everyone admired. Jo had gone to the barber and sold it. When she pulled off her bonnet in our parlour, the cropped head that emerged said more than any declaration of sacrifice could. Her sisters exclaimed, some in horror, some in admiration. Their mother's eyes filled with tears, not only for the money thus gained, but for the love that had prompted it. My grandfather, hearing the tale, cleared his throat and pretended to study the fire so no one would see the way it moved him. It was a strange kind of transaction, that hair. It bought a ticket for their mother to travel to her husband. It brought a tangible answer to helplessness. Yet it also revealed how each of them had already been paying with less visible parts of themselves. Meg had spent her share of youth on other people's children. Jo had traded hours of freedom for the right to sit at a desk and write by night. Beth had poured her strength into making everyone else comfortable. Amy had sacrificed small vanities to keep her larger ambitions alive. But we still wonder whether love is measured more by what we give up, or by how quietly we continue to give long after the dramatic sacrifices are over. When the first shock of fear had settled and Mrs. March was away nursing her husband, I tried to lighten the burden by pulling the girls into our house whenever possible. We played music, read aloud, acted out scenes in the great empty rooms to make them echo with something other than worry. There is a kind of comfort in foolishness shared. It cannot change an illness or hasten a recovery, but it can keep despair from claiming all the corners of a day. You may know this small defiance yourself. Perhaps you have told a joke in a hospital corridor, or made tea in a kitchen where serious decisions waited in the next room. People sometimes mistake this for refusal to face facts. More often, it is a way of keeping the heart supple when it might otherwise harden. During those weeks, I began to grasp that work and love in the March family were entangled. They did not labor only to survive. They worked in order to care for one another, to keep promises, to make room for small joys despite scarcity. My own duties, by contrast, had always been staged for my future self, that distant young man who was expected to be impressive. Watching them, I started to suspect that a life built solely around becoming impressive might, in the end, prove rather empty. Their father's illness turned out not to be the end we had feared. News came at last that he would recover, slowly, under their mother's care. The house breathed again. Little economies resumed their secret dance. Plans were made for his return. Yet something had shifted in all of us. We had been reminded that the structures we lean on can be shaken at any moment. When I looked at the March sisters then, I no longer saw mere companions for my leisure. I saw fellow travellers on a road where no one was guaranteed an easy passage. They met that uncertain road with needles, schoolbooks, sheet music, and stubby pencils. I met it with scales on a keyboard and the unearned security of my grandfather's fortune. It would take me time to understand how far that difference reached, but the first glimpse of it came that winter, in their small sacrifices and the large love that made them seem, even in their want, strangely rich. If I had to choose the moment when childhood finally slipped from our shoulders, I would not name a birthday or a wedding. I would name the autumn when Beth fell ill, and the bright little house across the street grew so quiet that even the wind seemed to lower its voice. Until then, misfortune had been something we met with brisk cheer. Lost gloves, burnt dinners, unpaid bills. During those weeks, it stopped being a story and became a shadow sitting in the room with us. It began, as such things often do, with kindness. Beth had been visiting the Hummel family almost daily, carrying food and comfort into their close, chilly rooms. She came home a little paler each time, yet always smiling, insisting that the children merely needed care and cleanliness, that she was quite well. Illness to the rest of us was something that happened elsewhere, to strangers whose names were read out in church, never to the quiet heart of our own small circle. When she first took to her bed, everyone tried to treat it lightly. Jo scolded that Beth always did too much for everyone and never thought of her own strength. Meg smoothed the covers and promised that a few days' rest would restore everything. Amy, who disliked any talk of sickness, flitted in and out of the room, offering flowers or drawings, and then escaping downstairs the moment the air grew too serious. They behaved as families do when they sense danger approaching and hope, by sheer will, to keep it outside. My grandfather heard the gravity of the news before I did. He had a way of receiving information about the neighborhood without ever appearing to ask for it. One afternoon he mentioned in a tone that tried to be casual and did not succeed that Miss Beth was unwell and that I should inquire after her. There was a tightness about his mouth that told me this was no ordinary cold. At the March house I met an unfamiliar stillness. The usually busy parlour was tidy but unused, as if waiting politely for life to return. Footsteps and low voices drifted from upstairs. Mrs. March came to the door, composed yet strained, her hands folded very carefully as though they might tremble if she let them rest. She thanked me for coming, told me that Beth was ill and they were doing all that could be done, and did not invite me in. Behind her, on the staircase, I glimpsed Jo. Her face was white and fierce, like someone preparing for a battle that would be fought mostly in silence. The truth reached me in fragments. Beth had taken a dangerous fever from the Hummels, the sort that did not respect good hearts or careful habits. There were medicines to be given, instructions to follow, windows to be opened or closed at particular hours, but no sure promise of recovery. I found myself exiled to the edges of their struggle, barred from the sick room for safety's sake, my concern reduced to sending whatever comfort our great house could provide. We sent broth, fruit, clean linens, anything the doctor allowed. My grandfather, under the pretext of addressing the whole family, wrote a stiff note inquiring after her progress and offering assistance. Jo sent back a reply in her large, uneven hand, thanking him with a directness that pierced his formality. I saw him read that letter more than once, as if it said something about himself he had not expected to hear. But we still wonder whether being kept at a distance from suffering is a kindness or a cruelty, both to those who are hurting and to those who long to help. Perhaps you know that helplessness yourself, standing on a pavement outside a building where someone you love is ill, counting windows, watching curtains that never quite open, telling yourself that no news must mean good news, because you cannot bear to ask for more. I paced the length of our drawing room until the carpet might have learned my steps by heart, listening in vain for any sound from the little house that might signal a change. At last there came a day when I could not endure the not knowing. I crossed the street and knocked again. This time Jo opened the door herself. Only a week had passed, yet she looked older. Her hair was clumsily pinned, ink still smudged on her fingers, but the wild energy I always associated with her seemed banked, turned inward into a steady flame. "Is she?" I began. The rest of the question stuck somewhere between my chest and my throat. "She is fighting," Jo said simply. "The fever is strong, but so is Beth." She held the door only half open, a barrier of wood and good intentions between me and the sick room. For a few minutes we stood there on the threshold, talking in low voices. She spoke of long nights beside the bed, of their mother dividing her strength between prayer and practical tasks, of Meg's careful preparations, and Amy's frightened drawings made downstairs, because she was not allowed near the danger. I listened and offered what I could: errands, messages, the steady services of Hannah and our servants. It felt pitifully small measured against their vigil, yet Jo accepted it with a weary gratitude that humbled me. What struck me most was not the fear in her voice, though I heard it under every word, but the restraint. Jo, who could work herself into a tempest over a spoiled dress or a slight to her pride, had learned to measure each emotion before letting it pass her lips. Beth needed calm more than drama, and so Jo's love, for once, chose quietness. Days slid into one another. The doctor came and went. The girls moved like silent planets around the narrow bed where Beth lay. When I saw any of them in the street, their faces were thinner, their eyes shadowed, yet there was a light in them that refused to go out. Each had decided in her own way that love meant staying near, even when staying brought no assurance of a happy ending. Sometimes, when the weight in my own house grew too heavy, I sat at our piano and played the hymns Beth loved best. The notes drifted into the evening air and across the narrow distance between our windows. I told myself that sound was not bound by plaster and brick, that perhaps if I played with enough tenderness, the melody would find its way to her, a small thread connecting her sick room to the world beyond it. It did not cure anything, but it kept my worry from hardening into bitterness. At last, the message came, the kind that holds two truths at once. Beth was better, the worst had passed, yet she would never be as strong again. The illness had taken something subtle but permanent. When I was finally allowed to see her, she sat by the window in a shaft of pale light, thinner and more transparent, like music written in a finer hand. The gentleness in her face, however, was unchanged. Her smile when she saw me was like the first chord after a long silence. We spoke of clear, ordinary things, the weather, the flowers in our conservatory, the piano that missed her careful touch. She thanked me for the music drifting over the street, and admitted that sometimes she had not known whether she truly heard it or only dreamed she did. Either way, she said, it helped. In that moment, I understood that home had stretched across the road without my noticing. Our two houses, once separated by wealth and habit, were joined now by shared fear, shared relief, and a few familiar melodies carried on cold air. But we still wonder whether it is illness itself that makes us grow up, or the way we gather around it and discover how much of ourselves we are willing to give. Looking back, I see that autumn as the turning of a page. After Beth's illness, none of us were quite the same. The March sisters went on with their work and quarrels and small pleasures. But there was a new depth beneath their laughter, like a lower note added to a familiar tune. I returned to my music and my lessons. Yet I no longer believed the future was a distant, guaranteed country waiting patiently for me to arrive. We had stood together, as best we could, at the edge of a possibility no one wanted to name. Beth had stepped back from it, but the sight of that edge remained with us. It made the days that followed feel more precious, more precarious, and far more worth spending well. There is a particular cruelty in the way hope grows. It rarely announces itself and almost never asks permission. It begins as a small, bright thought, and before you realize it has taken root, it is already shaping the way you enter a room. I do not remember the exact day I understood that my life had tilted toward Joe March, but I remember the feeling. It was as if every bustling scene in their little house now had a hidden center, and that center was wherever Joe happened to be. If she argued with Meg about propriety, or with me about my future, the air itself felt more alive. She did not encourage me in any conventional way. Joe was far too honest for flirtations. She knocked my hat off when she was pleased with me and argued me into silence when she thought I was idle or vain. Yet I found myself listening for her footstep on the stair, measuring an evening's worth by how many times I made her laugh. Meg's gentle admiration warmed me. Beth's gratitude humbled me. Amy's hero worship amused me. But it was Joe's approval I began to hunger for. Meanwhile, the world around us moved forward in ordinary fashion. Mr. March returned home, frailer but alive, and the house filled with a steadier kind of contentment. The girls' labours continued. Only now, beneath the familiar pattern, certain lines began to redraw themselves. The first of those lines passed through Meg. John Brooke, my tutor, had always moved in and out of the March house with an air of quiet respect. He was not brilliant or dashing like the heroes Joe invented, but there was a firmness in him I admired. He taught me Latin, but his real lessons were in the way he carried his responsibilities, modestly and without complaint. It should not have surprised me that his gaze lingered a little longer on Meg. She was the sort of girl any sensible man might hope to marry. Gentle, practical, pretty, without knowing it, capable of turning even a poor room into a welcoming place. Yet, when I first realized that Brooke's interest was not merely fraternal, I felt as if someone had altered the script of a play I thought I knew by heart. Meg, for her part, was torn between the allure of a more comfortable life and the quiet, persistent reality of John's affection. I watched this struggle play out not in dramatic speeches, but in small gestures. She would smooth the worn curtains at home after praising the drapes at a richer friend's house. She would tease me about my idle habits, then praise John for working diligently on a salary that barely covered his needs. When talk of suitors arose, she blushed in a way that told me she had already chosen where her heart was leaning, even if she had not yet admitted it aloud. Then there was Joe. For every inch that Meg moved toward the possibility of marriage, Joe seemed to retreat a yard. She declared that she would never be anyone's wife, that she preferred books and freedom and pen and ink. She laughed at the notion of romance as if it were a foolish play. She had no interest in acting. And yet, when Brooke's feelings for Meg could no longer be hidden, it was Joe who reacted as if the world were ending. She came to me fuming, railing against men who carried off sisters and upset households. I listened, half sympathetic and half amused, aware that what she really feared was change. If Meg must marry, let it at least be someone who will not steal her away from us, she cried. Someone who will not turn her into one of those idle dolls who talk only of clothes and visits. I did not tell her that John Brooke's hopes for Meg had little to do with idle comfort. Instead, in an act of foolishness I regret more than most of my youthful misdeeds, I tried to turn her anger into mischief. Together we concocted a teasing letter, meant to suggest that Brooke's intentions were far more presumptuous than they were. We intercepted, forged and meddled, playing with emotions as if they were scenes in one of Joe's stories. When the truth surfaced, as truths insist on doing, Meg was wounded, Brooke dignified in his offence, and Joe was left facing the cost of our prank. My grandfather was displeased. The March household was shaken. I, who had wanted only to keep things as they were, had in fact hastened change. For a time, it seemed as though the damage might be irreparable. Meg retreated into herself, ashamed of having been made a spectacle. Brooke kept his distance, more out of respect than resentment, though I read the quiet sadness in his eyes. Joe refused to cry, which I took as a sign that she was hurting more than she knew how to name. In those days I moved uneasily between the two houses. At home, my grandfather reproved me for meddling in serious affairs. At the Marches, Mrs. March spoke to me with grave kindness about responsibility, about the difference between harmless fun and tampering with another person's future. Her words settled on my conscience with weight. And yet, from this clumsy chaos, something steadier grew. Brooke did not abandon his affection. Meg, having been forced to examine her own heart, found there a quiet, steadfast liking that deepened once it was honestly faced. In time, their engagement was settled with fewer theatrics than Joe or I would ever have put into one of our invented dramas. Watching them, I felt two emotions unfold at once. On the one hand, genuine happiness for Meg, whose desire for a home of her own was finally taking shape. On the other, an uneasy tightening in my chest, as I realized that if one sister could leave the little circle we had made, others might follow. In the evenings, I still played the old tunes at their house. I still walked with Joe, arguing about books and the future. But under every conversation lay a quiet question I did not dare voice. Would there come a day when I, too, would ask to alter the shape of her life? And if I did, would she let me? But we still wonder whether hope makes us braver in love, or only more afraid of the answer that might one day break it. If stories obeyed the wishes of young men, I suppose Meg would have stayed at home forever. Joe would have remained my wild comrade in mischief, and the 4 March sisters would have gone on living together under that shabby, welcoming roof. But stories obey time, not wishes, and time began to move more briskly through our little neighborhood. Meg's wedding was the first unmistakable proof that none of us could stay where we were. It was not grand. There were no carriages lined up in rows, no glittering chandeliers, only flowers gathered by willing hands, and a house arranged to make room for more happiness than space. I remember that day as a series of small images rather than a single scene. Meg's dress, simple and lovely. Mr. Brooks standing straighter than usual, as if the weight of his new responsibilities had already settled on his shoulders. My grandfather in his best coat, pretending to disapprove while secretly approving very much. Most of all, I remember the way Joe moved through the crowd, half proud and half bereaved. She had always said she hated weddings and would rather face a battle than a bridal procession. Yet she worked tirelessly to make everything ready for her sister. She pinned flowers, arranged chairs, and teased Brooke until even his gravity relaxed into smiles. Only when Meg walked away on her husband's arm did Joe's brave cheer falter. Later, when the guests had gone, I found her in a corner of the empty parlour, twisting the end of a ribbon between her fingers. The house already felt larger and lonelier without Meg's steady presence. "Well, it is done," she said. "We have lost her, Teddy." "You have not lost her," I answered. "She has only widened the family. There is more of you now, not less." Joe gave me a look that mixed affection with frustration. "You do not know what it is," she said, "to have someone who has always been there step into another life. It is right, but it feels as if one room of the house has been locked, and the key is not ours anymore." Her words lodged in me. I too felt the new distance. Meg's cottage was not far away, yet every visit required more intention than simply walking next door. There were babies to consider, hours to respect, a husband whose tiredness must be honoured. The airy dreams we had once shared rearranged themselves to make room for bills and cradle songs. In reaction to this, I threw myself all the harder into my own plans. When I went away to college, Joe sent me off with a parting lecture that might have daunted a less stubborn fellow. She demanded that I do something worthwhile with the privilege I had been given, that I not turn idleness into an occupation. I laughed and promised more than I understood. She stood on the steps, hair blowing about her face, waving as if she were sending a soldier to the front. College life wrapped itself around me. Lectures, music, the easy camaraderie of other young men. I worked enough to satisfy my grandfather and Joe's letters, and played enough to keep boredom at bay. Yet even in the liveliest evenings there were moments when a familiar ache returned. A joke or a song would remind me of the little parlour at the Marches, of Joe reading aloud with her legs thrown over an armchair, of Beth at the piano, of Amy sketching noses she meant to improve one day. I visited home when terms allowed. Each return showed me how swiftly things could change while one was away. Meg's twins grew from bundles to small, demanding people. Amy's sketches gained surer lines. Beth, though cheerful, seemed a shade more delicate each time. Jo talked loudly of her stories, her ambitions, our old plans for theatres and travels. Yet there was a new restlessness behind her laughter, as if she were arguing mostly with herself. I too was changing, though I did not always admit it. My affection for Jo, once entirely companionable, settled into something deeper. I found myself planning futures that always included her, sometimes without any clear image of what those futures contained. Only the conviction that they would be less worth having if she were not in them. There came an evening during one of my returns when the sense of waiting became almost unbearable. We had been walking together, arguing over some book or other, and when we reached the gate of her house, Jo fell strangely silent. The lamplight caught the familiar angles of her face, softened now by a seriousness we had not known as children. "Teddy," she said at last, "do not ever let college turn you into one of those young men who complain of the world and never lift a finger to mend it." I promised, half lightly, half in earnest, and added that I had my own hopes, which would be easier to pursue if I had a certain wild girl beside me to keep me honest. The joke fell flat between us. Jo's hand tightened on the gate. We did not speak of it then. I went back to my rooms with the uncomfortable knowledge that my feelings were beginning to spill over whatever boundaries friendship had once provided. She went back into her busy house, where change continued its quiet work. But we still wonder whether love grows clearer in separation or becomes more tangled, fed by imagined futures and unspoken fears. Looking back, I see how everything overlapped. My studies, my music, my loyalty to my grandfather, my affection for all 4 March sisters, my particular hope regarding one of them, all sounded together like voices in a quartet, trying not to drown one another out. If you have ever been young and pulled in many directions at once, you know the feeling. You promise yourself you will honor every obligation and keep every friendship as it is, and somehow also step into a future larger than any of them. No one tells you that gaining one thing may mean loosening your hold on another. By then, the stage was already set for the day when hope, long ripened and carefully hoarded, would either be answered or refused. I only knew that each visit home left me more certain of what I wanted and less certain of how to ask for it. There is a particular kind of courage required to turn a cherished hope into spoken words. As long as it lives only in the mind, it can be amended, adorned, excused. Once it leaves the mouth, it must face the world as it is. By the time I returned home for the visit when I meant to ask Jo to marry me, my hope was no longer content to stay inside my own head. It paced like a caged thing, restless whenever I thought of her. I told myself that nothing essential would change. We had always been companions in mischief, partners in every grand scheme. Marriage, in my naive imagination, would be only a continuation of that comradeship, formalized and furnished with a house of our own. We would read together, write together, travel, quarrel, make up, grow old side by side. I did not yet understand that Jo had dreams in which I did not always stand at the centre. The day I chose to speak was one of those soft spring days when even the streets seemed to breathe more easily. I found her in the garden behind the March house, hacking at the rose bushes with more energy than delicacy, sleeves rolled up, an old brown dress, and no gloves, hair pinned any which way. My heart insisted on seeing her as inevitable, as if the whole world had been quietly built around that stubborn figure in the patchy grass. We walked, as we had done 100 times, out beyond the houses to the little hill where one could see the town laid out below. The air smelled of thawing earth and river water. Jo talked in her usual fashion, darting from subject to subject, leaping from books to politics to some new story she meant to write. I heard only the spaces between her words and the steady hammering of my own heart, searching for an opening. At last, when she paused to catch her breath, I stepped into the silence. I will not repeat what I said. Young men in love rarely improve upon one another. I remember only that I spoke too quickly, promising more than I could possibly understand, offering her every corner of my future as if it were mine alone to give. I remember the sudden stillness in her, the way her shoulders tightened, the way her eyes, usually so quick to spark, grew wide and frightened. The world around us, with its soft wind and distant chimneys, seemed to retreat until there was only her face and my foolish, hopeful words hanging in the air. Her refusal, when it came, was not cruel. Cruelty would have been easier to bear. She spoke gently, stumbling a little over the phrases, yet absolutely firm. She loved me, she said, dearly, but not in the way I wished. She could not imagine herself a wife, least of all my wife, because the very idea seemed to her a kind of cage. She feared we would make each other unhappy, that we were too alike in our tempers and restlessness, that we would chafe each other raw once the novelty of our affection wore off and real life began. I argued, of course. What young man does not argue when his future is denied him? I told her she was mistaken, that we were made for one another, that friendship of our sort must inevitably ripen into love. I spoke of our long history of shared jokes, of conspiracies and rescues and winter evenings by the fire. She shook her head, tears bright in her eyes, yet would not yield. Her loyalty to me would not permit her to promise what her heart could not keep. In that moment, I felt as if the ground itself had shifted under me. The hill where we stood, once a place for dreams and inventions, became the stage of an unexpected ending. I had imagined so many possibilities for my life, all of them with Jo's quick step keeping time beside mine. None of them had included the simple, devastating fact that she might say no and mean it. But we still wonder whether a heart breaks cleanly in one moment, or in a series of small, sharp cracks that go on sounding long after the scene itself has ended. The walk back to the house was shorter than it had ever been, though we took the same path. I remember almost nothing of what we said. I recall only the way Jo kept a careful distance between us, as if afraid that any accidental brushing of hands might make her resolve falter. At the gate, she tried to jest, to smooth over the harshness of what had passed, but the effort was thin and wobbled at the edges. For the first time since I had known her, Jo's words felt like a shield rather than a bridge. In the days that followed, we saw one another, but the old ease was gone. She spoke to me as kindly as ever, yet there was a new care in her manner, as if every sentence had to be weighed before it could cross the space between us. The others noticed the stiffness, though they were polite enough not to name it. I threw myself into restless busyness. I rode too hard, played too loudly, quarrelled with my grandfather over nothing at all, and made vague, grand plans to go abroad. Anything was better than sitting still long enough to feel the empty place where my hope had been. You may recognize this impulse. Perhaps you have filled your days with noise and motion, simply to avoid hearing the quiet sentence that has already been spoken over a cherished dream. Movement feels like power when acceptance seems impossible. Stillness would have forced me to admit that what I wanted was not, and never had been, entirely mine to choose. It was Meg, now Mrs. Brooke, and already wise in a way I had failed to appreciate, who gently turned my face toward that truth. One evening in her small cluttered parlour, with baby's toys underfoot and mending in her lap, she spoke to me without pretense. "Love," she said, "is not something owed in return for loyalty or familiarity." Jo had done me a hard kindness by refusing what she could not truly give. A promise taken from her against her nature would have been a cruelty to us both. I knew she was right. Knowing did not soften the ache, but it kept resentment from hardening entirely. For a time, however, I let the ache turn to bitterness all the same. I avoided the March house more than politeness required. When Jo's name came up at home, I changed the subject. I told myself I was done with childish attachments and would live a larger, more impressive life that would prove I had never needed her consent. It is remarkable how quickly injured pride will dress itself up as dignity if you let it. My grandfather, who had quietly hoped for a different ending, watched this transformation without much comment. He did not lecture. He simply grew more thoughtful, and at last suggested that travel might widen my ideas. Europe, he said, would make a man of me if I would let it. I accepted with a show of indifference I did not feel. Going abroad sounded like escape, and escape was the only thing I could imagine that might quiet the constant echo of Jo's refusal. On the morning of my departure, the March house looked as it always had, with its peeling paint and narrow windows. Yet nothing about it felt the same. Jo shook my hand with an effort at cheer, wished me good work and good conduct, and told me to come back improved. I, foolish to the last, tried to sting her with a light remark about finding more agreeable company elsewhere. The wince that crossed her face was brief, but it haunts me still. I left that day carrying more than trunks. I carried the weight of words spoken too passionately, of pride where humility would have been more fitting, of a love that had insisted on its own shape instead of listening to the shape the other heart could bear. From the deck of the ship that took me away, I watched the coastline recede and told myself that distance would do what acceptance had not. I would learn languages, see great cities, bury my disappointment under new experiences. Yet, on quiet nights, when the sea stretched out like an unwritten page, and the stars hung over it like unwelcome advice, my thoughts drifted back to a small New England hill and a girl with ink-stained fingers, explaining in a voice that shook that she was not made to be anyone's wife. I did not understand then that she was fighting for something precious in herself, something that might have withered if she had yielded to my desire. I only knew that my own plans lay scattered at my feet, and I had not yet learned how to walk without them. Europe, everyone assured me, would set me right. It was spoken with the easy confidence of people who believe miles can mend what words have broken. My grandfather called it finishing your education. I let him think I went for art and languages. I knew that more than anything I was fleeing the hill where Joe had said no. At first, distance disguised itself as cure. Paris dazzled, Vienna sang. I sat in galleries and concert halls, nodding wisely at statues and symphonies, as if appreciation alone could pass for maturity. I learned how to order coffee in several languages, and how to look occupied when I was only restless. People called me promising in that vague way which really means has done nothing yet. I began to suspect they were right. Letters from home trailed after me like a quieter melody. Meg wrote of babies and economies. Joe wrote from New York of cheap lodgings, bad dinners, and the fierce satisfaction of earning money with her pen. Beth thanked me for music I no longer played nearby. Amy grumbled about crooked noses in her drawings and boasted of Europe as if she had invented it. I read each letter quickly, then put it away even faster, as though the paper burned. Then, one day, in a Paris salon, Amy herself stepped back into my life. She was standing by a window, dress well cut, but not extravagant, speaking careful French to a lady twice her age. Gone were the schoolgirl braids and the comic airs of grandeur. Yet there was the same firm tilt of the chin, the same glint that meant she would not be easily overawed. When we were introduced, she looked me over with undisguised amusement. "Well, Teddy," she said, "Europe suits me. I am not yet sure what it has done for you. It ought to have stung, but there was no malice in it, only a sisterly frankness I had not realized I missed." Very quickly we fell into a pattern of shared days, walks to galleries, visits to churches, the occasional respectable supper under Aunt March's vigilant eye. In the museums, Amy did not drift like the other young ladies, collecting famous names for their conversation books. She stood very still in front of each painting, judging not only the beauty, but the labor behind it. "Here the work is honest," she would say, tapping her sketchbook. "Here the artist has only decorated." She spoke of her own efforts without false modesty. She did not expect to be a genius, only to be diligent and true. Her judgments, which began with paintings, soon turned toward me. "You are practicing idleness," she observed once as we crossed a bridge in Rome. "Very charming idleness, but still, with what you have been given, you might at least decide what you mean to be." I bristled and muttered something about heartbreak, as if that explained everything. "Yes, your heart was broken," she said quietly. "That happens. But if you sit forever inside that hurt, it will become an excuse instead of a wound. A broken heart is not a profession, Teddy. What will you use it for? But we still wonder whether real care is the arm that comforts us where we lie, or the hand that insists we stand up. If you have ever had a friend refuse to admire your sadness, you know the feeling. It is like being asked to put on stiff new shoes when you have grown fond of walking barefoot and complaining of stones. Unpleasant at first, until you realize you can go farther in them. Under Amy's steady gaze, Europe changed. The same streets and statues remained, but they no longer disguised my aimlessness. I began to get up earlier, to practice with attention instead of flourish, to read the books my grandfather had once only hoped I would open. I turned down some invitations simply because they led nowhere. To my surprise, the days grew quieter, but not duller. Amy adjusted to this new version of me with graceful matter-of-factness. She treated my small efforts as nothing extraordinary, which somehow made me want to continue them. We talked more and more, not about passing pleasures, but about work, purpose, the kind of lives we might one day be willing to answer for. She spoke of art that served truth, of a household orderly but not petty, of wanting to be useful instead of merely admired. It sounded, to my ears, suspiciously like adulthood. Meanwhile, the letters from home changed tone. Meg's happiness had the tired edges of real responsibility. Joe wrote less of plays and more of hard-earned stories and difficult editors. Beth's messages grew shorter and, to my eye, too calm. She was very tired, quite content. Phrases that frightened me more than any mention of pain. The news of her death came on a bright Italian morning. Sun poured onto the stones outside my window. A barrel organ played below in the street. I opened the letter, expecting the usual small news, and instead found a gap where Beth should have been. The sentences were simple. She had gone quietly. She had suffered little. She had smiled at the last. The words lay flat on the page, and yet carved themselves to the bone. Amy found me sitting with the letter still open. She did not try to reason it away. She sat beside me and slipped her hand into mine, small and steady. We spoke of Betoff, the way she bent over the piano, of her shy gratitude in my grandfather's grand rooms, of the softness she brought into every place she entered. We cried a little, and then sat in silence, listening to the ordinary noise of a city that had no idea what it had just lost. Grief has a way of closing the distance between people who share it. In that silence, the miles between Italy and Concord seemed at once vast and very small. I saw as clearly as if I stood in the March parlour, Joe by the empty chair, Meg trying to be brave for everyone at once, my grandfather reading the same letter more than once, as if repetition might improve it. For the first time since I had left, going home felt less like retreat and more like duty. Something else shifted that day, though I did not name it then. My love for Joe, which had been a raw, insistent thing, turned quieter. It no longer pushed against every thought. It became part of the landscape, like a hill one has climbed and descended. When I looked at Amy, eyes red and determined to be useful even in sorrow, I saw not Joe's sister, nor a consolation prize for a lost dream, but a person who had met me in my worst season and refused to leave me there. From that point on, my steps, which had wandered so long, began at last to lean toward home. It is a strange thing to fall in love twice within the borders of the same family, and yet not feel that the second affection is an imitation of the first. When my heart slowly turned toward Amy, it did not cancel what I had felt for Joe. It altered it. Joe remained the friend who first treated me as a comrade rather than a curiosity, the one who opened the little house across the street and let me step into its noise and warmth. But the restless hope that once clung to her began at last to loosen its grip. After Beth's death, Amy and I travelled more, though the gaiety of our excursions was muted by the knowledge that one chair in one parlour an ocean away would never again be filled. Grief made us gentler with each other. We did not pretend to forget. We carried Beth with us like a third quiet companion who walked a little behind and asked only to be remembered. In this altered companionship, I began to see Amy clearly. She was no longer the vain child obsessed with gloves and noses, but a young woman who had been quietly working on herself while the rest of us dramatized our troubles. Her ambition, once a matter of pretty things and praise, had acquired a sterner edge. She wanted to make beauty, not merely enjoy it. She wanted a life that combined comfort with purpose, and she meant to earn the first and deserve the second. One afternoon in Rome, we sat before a famous statue. Amy regarded it for a long time, then shook her head. "It is accomplished," she said, "but it is not brave." I asked what bravery had to do with marble. "Everything," she answered. "Some artists carve what people wish to see. Others carve what they cannot help but say. The first gain praise. The second may be laughed at, but they are the ones who move the world a little." Her words unsettled me because they did not apply only to statues. I had spent much of my youth choosing the accomplished path over the brave one. I had studied where I was told to study, played the pieces people liked, drifted into circles that required no risk. Jo had rejected the safe script I offered her. Amy, without cruelty, was asking whether I meant to keep reciting it alone. But we still wonder whether courage begins as a feeling or as a decision taken, while the heart is still reluctant. Amy also spoke with new honesty about her own future. She did not intend to chase fame in art at any cost. The world, she said, was full of gifted women worn thin by poverty and disappointment. She would paint as well as she could, exhibit when it was honest, and accept that her truest work might be a household ordered with grace and a character strong enough to shelter other people's growth. These were not the words of a child who longed only for admiration. They were the plans of someone who had seen up close how much courage ordinary love could require. Alone in my lodging, I began to measure my intentions against hers. What did I mean to do with the wealth and freedom I had been handed? I could no longer pretend that I was simply waiting for life to begin. It had already begun, with loss, with error, and, unexpectedly, with a second chance. Our understanding grew slowly, like colour deepening on paper. There was no sudden confession. Instead, there were small moments in which the distance between us lessened. A joke over a dreadful painting, a walk cut short by rain that sent us under one too small umbrella, the way Amy's voice softened when she spoke of my grandfather, whose quiet approval she sought as sincerely as I ever had. Jo's name did not vanish from our talk. We did not pretend she had never been the centre of my hopes. Yet a calmness settled around that fact. Amy spoke of her sister with clear-eyed loyalty. She saw Jo's brilliance and her blind spots, her tenderness and her temper. Loving Jo for Amy meant neither idolizing nor resenting her. That steadiness convinced me that the affection growing between us was not built out of comparison or consolation. It was, improbably, its own new thing. Letters from home tugged us back toward Concord. Meg wrote of tired happiness and tight budgets. Jo wrote of New York boarding houses, of criticism that hurt and helped. of learning to write stories that did not merely sell, but also satisfied her conscience. My grandfather wrote briefly, but the spare lines hinted at loneliness and at a hope that I might come home changed, not merely older. In the end, it was not some dramatic turning point that fixed our course, but a gradual clarity. One evening, in a small garden scented with orange blossoms, we spoke not of if, but of after. After we went home. After I proved, by steady work, that I could be more than a pleasant disappointment. After we had faced our families with the truth, rather than startling them with a sudden announcement. Amy looked at me and asked in her direct way whether I was willing to work, really work, not just at business or music, but at being a man who added more than he consumed. The question went deeper than romance. It asked whether I meant to spend my life as an ornament or as a participant. I said yes, and knew that I was not merely speaking a hopeful word, but stepping into a vow. We walked on a little way in silence, aware that something had shifted between us. But we still wonder whether the person who returns from a long absence is truly the same as the one who left, or whether every mile travelled writes a small difference into the soul. When at last the coastline of home lifted out of the haze, it did not look smaller for having seen other countries. It looked more precise, as if distance had sharpened my sight instead of dulling it. Somewhere beyond that line of trees waited a great house that had once echoed with my idleness, a smaller house that had taught me the cost of love, and a future I had finally begun to choose, rather than simply inherit. Home returned to me first as cold air. New England wind cut through my coat as the train slowed, carrying the clean, spare smell I had missed without knowing it. Then I saw the low line of our hill, the cluster of dark roofs, and my grandfather on the platform, straight-backed, his hand tight on the cane he hardly needed. Amy stood beside me, very still and very sure. Travel had stripped away her affectations and sharpened her purpose. She carried her sketchbox like a tool, not a toy. When my grandfather bowed over her hand with his old formality, she answered with clear, composed warmth. I watched his stern face shift, just slightly. He had sent away a moody boy and received back not only a more sober grandson, but a young woman who met his gaze as an equal rather than a guest. The March house, when we reached it, looked smaller than ever, yet the air inside felt strangely vast. Grief had made an extra room there. Beth's place by the window was empty, yet carefully kept. Her music sheets lay on the piano, edges worn by years of quiet practice. Her name trembled just behind every conversation. No one pretended she had slipped from mind, only from sight. Meg greeted us with flower on her cuffs and a child on each arm, tired and shining all at once. Jo came in with ink-stained fingers and a New York briskness in her step. She talked fast, laughed loud, but there was a new center of gravity in her. I could feel it in the way she listened between her own words, as if measuring them against some inner standard she had not possessed before she went away. That first evening by their fire, with the kettle singing and the children underfoot, I realized that something inside me had settled while I was gone. I no longer looked up every time Jo moved as if my future depended on her next expression. I loved her still, but the love had changed key. It had dropped into that steady register where affection has nothing to prove. Amy felt it. She relaxed in small ways, laughing more easily, teasing Joe without the old sharpness. Joe, too, seemed newly at ease with me. When the others slipped away on various errands, and we paused together by the dark window, watching our reflections in the glass, she studied me with her direct, searching gaze. "You are improved, Teddy," she said, "less determined to have the world arranged to your liking." "Europe and a few hard lessons did their work," I answered. "So did 1 or 2 March girls." She smiled then, without strain. Whatever lay broken between us had healed into something we could both touch without pain. I heard of Professor Bear gradually. Joe quoted a friend who disliked her sensational tales. Later she mentioned the professor, who brought her better books. Then, one day, she called him Friedrich, and a softness entered her voice I had not heard there before. Once, that single change would have pierced me. Now it only told me she had found a language that was not mine. When I met him at last in the crowded parlour, he was nothing like the rival I had once imagined. He was older than Joe, plainly dressed, bearded, his English careful and accented, his eyes serious and unexpectedly gentle. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak to her about her work, the whole room seemed to narrow to the space between them. He asked what she truly meant in a scene, whether she believed what she had written, whether she could write something better if she trusted her own experience instead of chasing applause. Another writer might have bristled. Joe glowed under that scrutiny. She had always liked a fair fight. Here, at last, was someone arguing not with her temper, but with her talent. Watching them, I felt the last sharp fragment of my former hope loosen and fall away. She had not chosen a boy to share her mischief, as I had once dreamed, but a man who steadied her and challenged her in the same breath. I saw that I had loved the idea of racing beside her forever, while he was ready to walk with her into work and responsibility. She had chosen well, but we still wonder whether the people we first dream of are meant to stand at the center of our story. Hỏi chi là những người dẫn ta đến với chính mình, và với những người đồng hành thật sự cần chờ đợi ta. At the same time, my own understanding with Amy was ripening. There was no dramatic proposal. Our agreement unfolded like morning light, almost unnoticed until the room was bright. One day, my grandfather looked at the two of us across the tea table and asked, with no preamble, when I meant to stop drifting and start working in earnest, since I clearly did not intend to do it alone. Amy did not blush or flutter. She met his gaze calmly. She said she would be ashamed to waste what I had been given, and what she had been given too. He grunted, which from him was consent. Later he told me in private to give her real responsibilities, not glass cases to stand in. He need not have worried. Amy had already begun. She talked budgets with Meg, gently improving them. She questioned me about business until I understood the figures I had once repeated by rote. She walked through my grandfather's big, echoing rooms and spoke of concerts, pupils, and gatherings that might fill them with something better than dust. She did not want to overturn what he had built. She wanted to put it to use. There were days of simple pleasure, too. We took Meg's children sledding on the same little hill where Joe and I had once fallen together in a tangle of limbs. The children shrieked as if they were conquering mountains. Amy scolded me for racing them too fast, then tried to beat our best time and vanished into a snowbank, emerging so white and laughing that even my grandfather, watching from the road, forgot to look severe. In quieter moments, Amy sat beside the piano while I played the hymns Beth had loved. At first, my hands trembled on the keys, but her steady turning of the pages made the music feel less like a wound and more like a bridge. The notes stitched our present comfort to the humbler days when Beth's shy persistence had first brought music back into my grandfather's house. Jo kept working, pacing, tearing up pages that did not satisfy her. Sometimes she burst in to read us a paragraph that finally rang true. Sometimes she talked of the school she and Friedrich hoped to open at Aunt March's old place, a house full of wild boys and overgrown gardens, where no child would be despised for being poor or peculiar. As she spoke, I recognized the same fire that had once sent her flying across the ice and into foolish schemes, now turned toward something that might last. Looking at them all, I saw how our little circle had widened. Meg and John were raising their children in a cottage that felt half home, half classroom. Jo and Friedrich were planning to turn an old mansion into a refuge for misfit boys. Amy and I were beginning to ask how best to spend not only money, but time and attention. The March girls were no longer simply little women learning their lessons. They had become, each in her way, makers of places where other lives could grow straighter and braver than our own. And I, once the lonely boy in the big house across the street, was no longer standing outside that bright window. I was in the light now, sleeves rolled up with the rest, learning slowly that happiness is less something that happens to us than a work we choose to join, day after ordinary day. It is one thing to speak of building a future, and another to rise each morning and quietly begin to construct it. Grand declarations are made in gardens and on hilltops. Real lives are built in kitchens, offices, classrooms, and the long corridors of ordinary days. After the first brightness of homecoming faded, this was the season we entered, the season of work. My grandfather, having regained his grandson and acquired a prospective granddaughter-in-law, lost no time in testing whether my resolve would hold. He put me under the eye of his lawyers and business partners, sent me to sit in on meetings where words like investment, obligation, and responsibility replaced the more romantic vocabulary I had once favored. At first, the figures swam before me like foreign characters. Slowly, under his gruff instruction and my newfound stubbornness, they began to steady into meaning. Amy watched this process with a mixture of amusement and concern. In the evenings, she asked questions no one in the office dared to pose. What did this enterprise accomplish beyond profit? Whose lives were touched by these decisions? Could charity be more than the scattering of coins after the fact? I found myself defending practices I barely understood, only to hear my own arguments falter in the light of her clear, persistent gaze. We began to speak, not of vague generosity, but of specific purposes. Music scholarships, funds for schooling boys who, like my younger self, had more energy than guidance. Quiet support for families in the neighborhood who lived as the Marches once had, counting each coin twice before letting it go. I had long considered philanthropy the business of ladies with leisure and gentlemen in retirement. Amy insisted it was the daily work of anyone with more than enough. In the March house and in ours, plans unfolded side by side. Joe and Professor Bear took possession of Aunt March's old place, its rooms full of stiff furniture and stricter memories. They set about remaking it into Plumfield, a school that felt more like a large, unruly family. The first time I visited, the dignified halls were full of running feet and half-finished projects. Jo looked happier in the midst of that chaos than I had ever seen her in a ball gown. She showed me their tiny library of battered books, the patch of ground she meant to turn into a garden, the room she dreamed would one day be a workshop for boys who preferred tools to Latin. Friedrich moved among the children with a kind, steady patience. They clung to him and argued with him in the same breath, which is generally a sign of respect disguised as rebellion. Watching them, I could not help remembering the quiet, empty rooms of my own childhood, and the way Beth's music had once sounded almost foreign in our polished parlours. Plumfield was the opposite of that silence. It hummed. It was a tune in search of words, and Joe and Friedrich were determined to help each child find his own. But we still wonder whether the best use of a fortunate life is to shield ourselves from the chaos of others, or to invite some of that chaos in and share the cost of shaping it. At home, Amy and I trained ourselves in smaller tasks. She took my arm through the streets of our town, making me truly see the places I had skimmed over as a boy. Here, a family with a broken fence and too many mouths to feed. There, a widow taking in washing beneath a sign that had seen better paint and better days. She did not scold my former blindness. She simply asked again and again how we might turn our abundance into a kind of scaffolding, something people could use to build their own strength rather than a gift that expected gratitude. We hosted little gatherings where artists, teachers, and a few of my grandfather's more open-minded colleagues sat in the same room, talking about the town as if it were a shared project instead of a backdrop. Amy took notes afterward, sketching plans for exhibitions to fund schools, concerts to support Plumfield, commissions that might keep a struggling painter's lamp burning another month. Her pencil moved quickly. My understanding followed more slowly. On certain evenings, when business had gone badly or my own efforts seemed clumsy, I slipped away to the March house for comfort. There was nearly always some small crisis in progress. Burnt bread at Meg's, an escaped boy at Plumfield, a spilled bottle of ink over Joe's carefully written pages. Yet, in the midst of these flaws, there was a steadiness my own work sometimes lacked. They did not wait for perfect conditions before acting. They simply did what needed doing and learned from the mistakes along the way. You may know this feeling from your own labours. Perhaps there is a project or a relationship you have dreamed about elegantly, only to discover that its real form involves far more spilled ink and uneven steps than you imagined. It can be discouraging to see how far reality falls short of the image. It can also be strangely freeing once you accept that the mess is part of the making. In quieter hours, Amy and I talked about the kind of household we hoped to build together. She wanted beauty, yes, but not ornament for its own sake. She spoke of rooms arranged for conversation, for music, for children who might arrive, and for guests who had nowhere else to go. I wanted a home that did not echo as my grandfather's had, where the sound of laughter and ordinary quarrels would be considered a blessing rather than a disturbance. We did not yet know what shape that home would take, or how many sacrifices it would require. We only knew that we were no longer content to drift. The March family, in their different ways, had chosen their paths. Meg, in her small, earnest cottage, Jo in her boisterous school, even dear absent Beth, whose quiet endurance still influenced our choices, as if her hand rested on our shoulders. It was time, at last, for me to do more than stand at windows and wish. The year my mother-in-law turned 60, the March house once again became the centre of everything. Married daughters returned with husbands and children. Former pupils appeared taller and louder. Neighbours slipped in with pies and stories. It felt less like a party being planned than a family being quietly summoned. I walked up the familiar path with Amy on my arm and our little girl running ahead. On the register she had a proper name. In daily use she was Little Beth, for the way she listened with her head slightly bent recalled too clearly the aunt she would never meet. The gate still creaked, the old rosebush still leaned over the fence. Inside, noise and warmth closed around us. Meg's children darted through the hallway. 2 of Jo's boys from Plumfield fought to carry the heaviest parcels. Hannah, dusted in flour and authority, sent them left and right with a glance. In the middle stood Marmee, hair greyer, step slower, yet with the same steady gaze that had once held 4 anxious little girls, and now rested just as kindly on a roomful of grown men and women. It is one thing to honour a parent when you are young and dependent. It is another to look at her across 30 years and see how much of your better self is simply an echo of her unnoticed habits. We had come officially to celebrate her 60th birthday. Unofficially, we had come to thank her for years of invisible labour that had kept so many tempers, dreams and disappointments from flying apart. There were flowers to arrange, dishes to finish, chairs to borrow, children to wash and redress. Amy turned the plain table into something festive, with jars and garden blossoms. Meg stretched every recipe as she had once stretched every coin. Jo compiled a crooked program of songs and speeches, grumbling for form's sake while plainly delighted. I moved furniture, fetched trays, and let usefulness speak where eloquence might fail. In the midst of this bustle, I kept catching glimpses of the past. Meg's eldest son carried plates with his mother's old anxious care. One of Jo's roughest boys slowed as he passed Beth's empty place at the window, suddenly quiet. Little Beth climbed into Marmee's lap and studied her face with such grave attention that my throat tightened. The generations overlapped until, for a moment, I saw the 4 original sisters ghosting behind the tangle of children. But we still wonder whether a life is measured by its great occasions, or by these small gestures that repeat themselves long after the first hand that taught them has grown tired. When evening fell, we packed ourselves into parlour and dining room until the walls seemed to bulge. Jo, true to form, called the company to order with a whistle better suited to a schoolyard. Candles were lit, shadows climbed the familiar walls. They settled Marmee in the big armchair, as if enthroning her, though she protested. Her daughters drew close. Meg, with a scrap of mending still in her fingers, Jo with ink at the base of her thumb, Amy in a dress cut and altered by her own clever hands. Grandchildren claimed every spare corner. Jo's boys lined the doorway, trying hard to appear solemn. Jo spoke first. She thanked their mother for letting them fail and begin again, for insisting that work was a privilege and not a punishment, for believing that even their worst faults could be bent toward good. Meg followed, shy yet steady, grateful for the pattern of home their mother had given her one she tried to copy daily in a smaller, noisier house. Amy thanked her for neither indulging nor mocking her early vanities, but slowly turning her toward a beauty that could outlast fashion and misfortune. Others rose. John Brooks spoke of how much easier a young husband's road had been with such a mother next door. Professor Bear thanked her, in careful English, for receiving a foreigner as if he had always belonged. My grandfather stood so rare that even the smallest child noticed and admitted that this humble house had taught him a different measure of success than all his years of trade. When my turn came, I simply told the story I knew best, that once there had been a lonely boy in a great echoing house across the street, and that she had rescued him with plain suppers, ordinary talk, and a kind of unquestioning welcome that made him feel, for the first time, expected. I thanked her for letting me be one of hers long before marriage gave me the right to claim the name. She listened to every word with the same intent look she used to give a child's confession, as if each gratitude carried with it a fresh duty. When the room clamoured for her to answer, she smiled, shook her head, and then obeyed. Her reply was simple and, as always, quietly bracing. She spoke of her own temper, which we had rarely seen, but which, she confessed, had demanded many private struggles. She spoke of fear during the war years, of nights alone while their father was away, of decisions she had doubted even as she made them. Virtue, she told the younger faces, was not a medal won once for all, but a choice taken again each day, often in weariness and without witnesses. If her daughters had become good women, it was as much due to their own courage, and to the friends and husbands around them, as to anything she had done. If I have succeeded at all, she finished, it is only that we have stayed together and kept trying. The room held its breath. I looked around and saw, more clearly than ever before, the web her life had woven. From Meg's thrift to my grandfather's softened pride, from Joe's ink-stained fingers to the rough hands of the boys at Plumfield, from Amy's ordered eye to the flowers glowing on the table, from Beth's empty chair to the hush that always greeted her name. At the centre sat a woman who had never written a book or led a crowd, yet whose steady work had shaped each of us more deeply than any famous example we admired from afar. But we still wonder whether such quiet builders of homes and hearts will ever be named in history, or whether their legacy will simply live on in the way those they loved go on choosing, in their own turn, to stay, to work, and to keep trying. In the years that followed that crowded birthday, time ceased to move in leaps and bounds. It settled into a gentler rhythm, like an old waltz played more slowly than before. Children grew and outgrew their shoes. New pupils arrived at Plumfield, loud and uncertain at first, then gradually finding their places. My own work with my grandfather deepened, then slowly shifted as age loosened his grip and tightened mine. From the outside, our lives might have looked unremarkable. We did not become famous, though Joe's books began to travel farther than any of us. We did not overturn governments or command armies. Yet, when I sit now at my desk and look back across the span of those years, I see how many quiet revolutions took place in parlours and schoolrooms, in kitchens and gardens, in the hearts of those little women who were no longer little, and yet, to me, always will be. Meg's cottage remained the first outpost of steady domestic peace. There were quarrels, of course, about money and children and curtains, just as there are in every honest household. John's health wavered at times, and there were seasons when Meg's hands seemed always to be in motion, sewing, soothing, stirring. Yet underneath the fatigue lay a contentment no ball or carriage ride could ever have given her. She had once dreamed of being a lady in a grand house. Instead, she became the quiet centre of a modest one, and in that role she found a dignity deeper than elegance. Joe and Friedrich turned Plumfield into something that did not quite resemble any school my grandfather had ever heard of. Boys who would have been written off as useless elsewhere were given gardens to tend, stories to write, tools to wield. Discipline existed, but it was tempered with understanding. If a child failed, the question was not, how do we punish him, but what has he not yet been taught? Their work was never finished. Children grow up and move on. New ones arrive with new mischief and new wounds. Yet Jo and her husband kept at it, mending where they could, bearing with what they could not, believing stubbornly that no soul was beyond the reach of patience and good work. Amy and I built our own household between these two poles, Meg's cottage and Jo's school. Our home, shaped by her eye and my willingness to be guided, became a place where music and conversation lived easily together. We hosted small concerts whose proceeds helped keep Plumfield supplied with books, or repaired a neighbour's roof, or paid a young artist's fees for a year. Amy painted less than she had once planned, but more truly. Some canvases were sold, some kept. The finest, in my opinion, never left our walls. Quiet scenes of family and friends, caught not in their grand moments, but in the pauses between them. Our little Beth grew straight and thoughtful. She did not play the piano as her aunt had, but she listened with the same intense absorption. Sometimes I would glance up from the keyboard and find her watching me with that familiar tilted head, as if she were listening to something beyond the notes. When she asked about the aunt whose name she bore, we told her not only of the sweetness and sacrifice, but also of the stubborn core that had allowed Beth to endure so much without bitterness. We did not wish our children to think goodness meant vanishing for the sake of others. But we still wonder whether the finest part of us is what we give away, or what we carefully keep alive, so that we can go on giving. You may have asked yourself a similar question at some crossroad in your own life. How much of your own dream can you sacrifice for someone else's need without losing the very self that dreamed it? We wrestled with that often, quietly, as every family does. There were opportunities I declined for Amy's sake, and chances she turned away from, so that our children and my grandfather need not feel abandoned. We did not always decide perfectly, but we decided together. That, I came to see, was the true shape of the life we had chosen. As for my grandfather, the old house across the street did not remain a mausoleum. It softened. Children's voices grew familiar in its halls. Jo's boys came for music lessons or advice. Meg's twins raided the pantry with a boldness that would once have scandalized the staff. Amy hung her paintings where ancestral portraits had once frowned alone. My grandfather, in his last years, took to sitting by a window that looked directly toward the March house, as he had done when I was a boy. Only this time the longing in his eyes was not for a life he had missed, but for one he had finally, if belatedly, joined. On the evening he died, the lamps were lit in both houses. Our family moved back and forth across the street as if it were a single front step. Jo came and read aloud from a book he liked, her voice steady even when ours faltered. Meg saw to the practicalities with that quiet efficiency her mother had taught her. Amy sat by his bed and held his hand, sketching his profile in her mind with a tenderness that needed no paper. When at last he slipped away, it was into a room full of familiar faces, not the echoing chamber he had once expected to grow old in. Loss did not end with him. Time kept its own books. Children left for colleges and voyages. Some of Jo's boys fell into trouble and had to be pursued with patience. Old friends departed as the years advanced. Yet, through all this motion, certain lines held. Sunday dinners at the March House, now presided over by Jo when Marmy's strength began to fail. Letters passed between Plumfield and our home, full of small stories that, taken together, formed a record of a shared life. The gate between the two properties grew loose on its hinges from constant use. As for Jo and me, we became, at last, what she had tried to tell me we were meant to be from the beginning. True friends who could look one another in the eye without debt or demand. When her books found readers beyond anything she had imagined, I sent her clippings from reviews I knew she would pretend not to care about and secretly treasure. When one of my ventures faltered, she arrived with a basket of food she claimed was for the children and advice that was plainly meant for me. We had not become the pair I once expected, but we had become something quieter and, perhaps, more durable. Now, as I sit here, with the night pressed against my window and the lamps low, memory lays out its long table. I see, as if they were all gathered again, 4 young girls in a shabby parlour, arguing over Christmas presents. I see a shy pianist breathing life into a lonely mansion. I see a governess, a writer, an artist, each wrestling in her own way with the question of who she will be allowed to become. I see a mother whose hands held all those threads together without ever asking whose name history would remember. And I see a boy at an upstairs window in a grand house, looking out at a square of light across the snow, not yet knowing that his whole mam is waiting there just beyond the courage to cross the street. But we still wonder whether the ordinary days we hurry through are in fact the very ones that shape us most, or if we will only recognize their quiet importance when we look back from some later, gentler shore of time. If you have walked with me this far, perhaps you too are thinking of your own small houses, your own loud kitchens and narrow stairways, the people who filled them and the choices you made there. We like to believe that greatness lives in crowds and headlines, yet I have learned that the truest work of love is done almost entirely in rooms where no audience sits and no applause is expected. So, when you next pass a lit window on a winter evening, or sit at a table worn smooth by years of elbows and plates, I hope you will pause for a moment. Listen for the faint music of old hopes, of lessons given and taken, of quarrels mended and meals shared. Remember the little women and men in your own life, and how fiercely they have tried, in ways the world may never record, to turn work into kindness and love into something that lasts. And if, in that stillness, A question rises in you about what kind of life you are quietly building. Do not be afraid of it. Let it stay. Let it soften you. Let it turn you, even by a small degree, toward the work and the people that matter most. The rest, as I have learned from the house across the street, will follow.